Before we get started with that, I'd like to begin by introducing you to Voices for Justice in Palestine. We are a social justice nonprofit dedicated to a just and lasting peace in Palestine, Israel. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their quest for liberation, justice, and equal rights. We believe in a shared future for all the people living between the river and the sea, based on freedom, self-determination, and equality for all. Locally, we are active in community education, legislative advocacy, marches, rallies, panel discussions, and media presence. We partner with liberation groups and coalitions to work for an end to the genocide in Gaza, a permanent ceasefire, massive humanitarian aid, release of hostages and political prisoners, and most importantly, an arms embargo. You can find out more about us at our website, voicesforjusticeinpalestine.org, and on Facebook and Instagram. We gratefully welcome your financial support for our work. We want to keep these webinars free, so we welcome your support to enable us to do that. You can find easy ways to donate on our platforms, and we sincerely appreciate your support. Kate has put or will put the donation link in the chat, and you can find us also on our website. One last step before we begin the presentations, Dr. Burhan Ganayem, the chair of our board of directors, would like to bring a word of welcome from our organization. Burhan.
I, hi, everybody. I wanted, first of all, to thank Mark and Kate for doing all the work. I wanted also to thank all of our members who are part of this webinar tonight. Without you all, guys, we cannot do this work. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for our support. I was involved in the last 4 or 5 months with a doctor friend of mine in Cary who started thinking to go to Gaza. And then I know his family, his wife, his parents, and I wanted you guys to know that my involvement in that gave me an understanding of what you are going through when you make the decision to pursue this step. I talked to his wife and his mother and his father, and it takes a lot of courage, a lot of strength for a wife to tell her husband, yeah, go ahead to Gaza, for a son to tell his, for a father to tell his son. So doctors, I wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I wanted to stand up, and I wanted all of you guys to stand up and bow in respect for our doctors. What you have done, very few people will do. What you have done, very few wives or parents or sons or daughters will say, yeah, go for it, go. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I wanted to just welcome you again, welcome all of our members and our guests tonight, and let us learn from the doctors. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Burhan. Lovely. Friends, we gather this evening 3 weeks from the 1-year anniversary of the October 7th attack and the onset of the horrific American-Israeli genocidal assault on Gaza. An experienced genocide researcher who recently returned from Gaza and the West Bank has stated that Israel is systematically combining the worst methods of oppression and extermination known to humanity: apartheid, ethnic cleansing, forced famine, relentless aerial bombardment, destruction of the very infrastructure of life, and directing all of these methods mercilessly against a largely defenseless Palestinian population, mostly women and children. He called it a vast ecosystem of genocidal and said it was far worse than anything he had ever witnessed or studied. UN experts whose job it is to track humanitarian disaster zones have run out of language to describe what is happening in Gaza. There is a level of human suffering, death, and destruction there that surpasses anything they have seen anywhere in the world. The Lancet, the respected British medical journal, estimates that the current stated death toll of 41,000 is a vast undercount, that the figure should be closer to 200,000, and that if current conditions are unchanged, the figure could very easily be 1 million by the end of 2024. Tonight, we are honored to present two U.S. physicians, Dr. Feroze Sidhwa and Dr. Mark Perlmutter, who volunteered in Gaza hospitals this past spring to treat traumatized, severely injured Palestinians. It is so vitally important that we absorb their first-person eyewitness accounts from the epicenter of the carnage and continue our shared work to stop the killing. So let me introduce first Feroze Sidhwa. Dr. Sidhwa is a trauma, critical care, and acute care surgeon who has done humanitarian surgical work since medical school in southern Zimbabwe, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Ukraine. He volunteered at European Hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza. And Dr. Mark Perlmutter is the president of the U.S. section of the International College of Surgeons and immediate past president of the American Academy of Neurological and Orthopedic Surgeons. He recently returned from a tour of hospitals in Gaza, where he assisted in treating civilian victims of the ongoing Israeli bombardments. So, with that, Feroze, I believe you'll go first. We look forward to your presentation. Again, warm welcome for being here. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just going to talk about the history of the Gaza Strip just briefly. It'll only take about 10 minutes. And then Dr. Perlmutter and I were actually in Gaza together, so he'll tell you plenty about what we saw. Is that working?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So hi everyone. Like Mark said, my name is Feroze Sidhwa. I'm a trauma and critical care surgeon out in California. I've been working on the Arab-Israeli conflict since I was in college. The second Intifada broke out when I was a freshman, and it became the thing on campus, and I just stuck with it since then. And since then, I've edited books on the topic for University of California Press and for OR Books in London and for the Institute for Palestine Studies. And I've written on the topic, so not just some random doctor telling you about the history of the Gaza Strip. But so anyway, thanks for giving me some time to talk today. There's only one wide-reaching history of Gaza, at least in English, and it begins with these words. This book is not about Gaza. It's about what has been done to Gaza. And similarly, Mark and I are not going to talk about Gaza, but about what's being done to Gaza now. It's kind of impossible, though, to understand what happened on and after October 7th of 2023 without understanding what Gaza was on October 6th. So what is Gaza? It's a small dot on the world map, and people can be forgiven if they don't know anything about it. So what is it? Well, geographically, Gaza is the panhandle of the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. It's very small. It's only 365 square kilometers, making it about the same size as metropolitan Philadelphia. Gaza is so small that it's actually walkable. In 10 hours, you can walk from the Rafah crossing, where we entered Gaza, to Beit Lahia, which is the northernmost part of the Strip. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Gaza City, which was the populated core of the Strip before October 7th, had a population density of 36,000 people per square mile, higher than New York City, and of course without the incredible height of New York's buildings or its legendary municipal services. The Strip overall has a population density of almost 15,000 people per square mile, which is greater than Boston. And today, 80 to 90% of Gazans are concentrated in tents in Rafah and along the coast, quite literally on a beach. Israel has announced its plan to move all 2 million Gazans to the Mawasi area, the beach, which would consist of 11 square kilometers of sand. And for reference, that's the same size as Los Angeles International Airport. Gaza is extremely poor. It's one of the poorest places in the world. Before October 7th, 46% of the population was unemployed, 60% of youth were unemployed, and 80% of the population was dependent on humanitarian assistance for bare survival. This had been the case since the massive destruction of Operation Protective Edge in 2014, a situation going on 11 years now. Gaza's population is also largely made up of refugees and their descendants. In 1948, 250,000 Palestinian refugees were expelled from the state of Israel into Gaza, overwhelming the 80,000 indigenous inhabitants. Today, refugees make up about 70% of Gaza's population. Gaza is also incredibly young. I think it's the youngest territory in the world. 50% of people in Gaza are under the age of 18. 40% are under 15, 15% are under age 5, and almost nobody is over the age of 60. Gaza has historically been a source of stiff resistance to the Israeli occupation, both unarmed and armed. After Israel conquered the Strip in 1967, it began an intensive campaign led by Ariel Sharon as the first head of the IDF Southern Command. By 1971, Israel had broken the armed resistance in Gaza. In 1987, the first Intifada started in Gaza, and while overwhelmingly nonviolent, it was met with tremendous violent repression. The Intifada was repressed by 1993. In 2000, the second Intifada broke out, also initially overwhelmingly nonviolent. It was repressed by 2004. Israel withdrew its settlers and military forces from the Strip that same year and redeployed its military to Gaza's periphery. Thereafter followed periodic Israeli assaults on Gaza to quell resistance to the ongoing occupation and the subsequent siege and blockade. In 2004, Operation Rainbow and Operation Days of Penitence. In 2006, Operation Summer Rains and Operation Autumn Clouds. In 2008, Operation Hot Winter. And later in 2008, Operation Cast Lead. In 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. In 2014, Operation Protective Edge. From 2018 to 19, the repression of the Great March of Return. And in 2021, Operation Guardians of the Walls. Gaza has been under what's called military occupation in one form or another since 1948, initially Egyptian occupation and now Israeli. But what this has meant for the territory is very well captured by these four resources. The first is a report from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It came out in 2017 and discusses the humanitarian impact of the occupation over 50 years. The second book is written by Edith Zertal and Akiva Eldar. One is an Israeli historian at the Institute for Jewish Studies at Basel University in Switzerland, and the other is the chief political columnist and editorial writer for Haaretz, which is Israel's most important newspaper. It covers another major aspect of the occupation, the settlement enterprise, and the systematic forced displacement of Palestinians that it entails. The third book is about the third major dimension of the occupation, which is the slow and steady destruction of the Palestinian economy, with the obvious effects that such a project would have on a societal scale over several generations. This book was written by Sarah Roy. She's Harvard's and certainly the world's leading expert on Gaza, and certainly on its economy. She's also the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And the fourth book is a standard history of the Arab-Israeli conflict by Israel's leading historian of the conflict, a very right-wing figure, Benny Morris. As he notes, I'm quoting, like all occupations, Israel's was founded on brute force, repression and fear, collaboration and treachery, beatings and torture chambers, and daily intimidation, humiliation, and manipulation. The protracted state of political subjugation and economic dependence and the day-to-day realities of military occupation meant a continuous trampling of the basic rights and dignity of the inhabitants of the occupied territory. Israeli propagandists tried to project an image of an enlightened occupation, but in fact, it was always a brutal and mortifying experience for the occupied, as well as a brutalizing experience for the occupiers. Gaza has been subjected to a unique process called de-development. The phrase was coined by Sarah Roy. In words she originally wrote nearly 30 years ago, quoting, "Despite its contentious and distinctive history, Gaza is consistently neglected by Middle Eastern scholars. However, it is important to examine the Strip because the Strip provides a stark clarification of the intentions and the consequences of Israeli policy. Gaza reveals poignantly the lineament and the texture of Israel's occupation, its harsh exterior and banal underside, its unique form and particularistic substance. Gaza dispels the myriad myths and illusions consistently invoked to legitimize Israeli control and depicts the bleakness of the future in which that control is allowed to persist. In my opinion, anyone who wants to understand what this little strip of land was on October 6th should read the last editions of Roy's book and then probably read it again. Gaza is also blockaded, which again is unique in the modern world. Since 2007, the Strip has been under a land, sea, and air blockade. It's been in place for 16 years now. This has had an enormously destructive impact on the standard of living in Gaza and has destroyed Gazan society's ability to provide to itself the necessities of life, which was its intended purpose. Again, if someone wants the details, these are probably the two best resources to look at. The book on the left is by an American Jewish political scientist named Norman Finkelstein. I helped edit the book, just in full disclosure. He's also the child of Holocaust survivors. The book on the right is the same one from Roy that I mentioned a moment ago. In summary, in many ways, Gaza is a unique place. It is compact, remarkably poor, incredibly young, highly repressed, occupied, subjected to economic de-development and outright blockade, a process that has played out over 57 years, which is longer than almost everyone in Gaza has been alive. The large majority of the Strip's population has never known anything beyond the harshest phase of this history, the blockade and periodic military assaults on Gaza since 2004. You can see that list of them here. Just to emphasize how little these things were actually covered in the American press, the last one on the right, Operation Shield and Arrow from 2023, is not actually Israel's response to the October 7th attacks. It was an attack on Gaza in May that I'm sure no one listening has ever even heard of. So, what was the healthcare system in Gaza like prior to October 7th? Well, there were 36 hospitals for 2.2 million people, with 3,400 acute care beds in total. This gave it 1.5 beds per 1,000 people, which is far lower than the rest of the world. For example, 7 beds per 1,000 people in Ukraine. Shifa Hospital in Gaza accounted for 21% of the beds and all of the advanced modalities of care. For example, the only other hospital with cardiac surgical services was European Hospital, where Mark and I worked. There was a heavy presence of international volunteer physicians, nurses, and ancillary staff throughout Gaza, and particularly at Shifa Hospital. The quality of healthcare outside of Shifa was really substandard, as it often is in many third world health systems, which is not at all uncommon. But in Gaza, the healthcare system suffered from a long history of direct attacks on healthcare facilities and healthcare workers by the Israeli military, specifically on ambulances, hospitals, and physicians. If anybody wants the details, the British medical charity Medical Aid for Palestinians and the Israeli human rights group Physicians for Human Rights Israel and B'Tselem, and the international organizations Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have the details on their website. Some of them are pretty shocking. Beyond that, there were chronic shortages of everything, which again is not unusual in the third world. But in Gaza, it was for quite a different reason than simple poverty. It was due to the blockade. And finally, there are vanishingly few opportunities in Gaza to train outside of Gaza because of the blockade. And indeed, 90% of Gazans have never left this tiny stretch of land. With the territory so young, under blockade for 16 years, the large majority of the population has no memory of ever not living under blockade, and virtually no one has any memory of living not under occupation. So that's what Gaza was when October 7th rolled around. Mark, you want to go next?
Sure. Now, you have no slides for me, correct?
I don't know.
Right. So, Feroze just gave a wonderful synopsis of how historically, Gaza has been hurt. But let me give some other perspectives. Gaza is smaller than Nagasaki, Japan, where we dropped the first atomic bomb in World War II. It has a smaller square. It's similar in size, but it's actually quite smaller. Since February of last year, before Feroze and I went there, the United States alone, not including Germany, France, or England, had supplied the equivalent of TNT that was dropped on Gaza that exceeded not just the atomic bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, which is bigger than Gaza, but also, in addition to that, the equivalent of the TNT tonnage that was dropped on Hiroshima months afterwards. And Hiroshima is 10 times the size of Nagasaki and was completely destroyed. It's 10 times the size of Gaza and was completely destroyed. So to put it in perspective, just the tonnage that our tax dollars has paid for has been enough to demolish both towns that drew an end to World War II in an area smaller than either one of those cities. So when we got there, it was an arduous trip to get there. The first thing that we smelled was sewage and the smell of gunpowder. It was not a long drive once we got through the Rafah crossing. But what we did notice when we got to the hospital rather quickly was the density of our patient population was unlike that we have ever seen before. Feroze has been to sub-Saharan Africa. He's been to the Ukraine. We've both been to Haiti. Myself, the day that the earthquake hit, I landed. I was at ground zero on 9/11, the day that the planes hit. And I was at Katrina the day that the earthquake struck. And I went back to Haiti four other times. And I think Feroze and I have said this on many venues together, that when you combine, as have many doctors, when you combine all of the experiences that we have seen in our life, and this is including 40 surgical missions over 30 years on multiple continents for myself. And I go to San Pedro Sula, Honduras, which is considered the murder capital of the world before Ukraine took that over, or actually before Gaza took that over. All of our combined experiences don't equal what we saw in our first week in Gaza. And specifically, the one issue that really permeates through all of us is that the density of children was insane. Now, there's multiple reasons for that. Feroze correctly stated, and emphasized that the population is skewed to a very young population. A young child, a toddler being experienced with a bombing is not going to survive that an adult may survive, so they're more vulnerable. They're certainly not going to fall out of a third-story collapsing building and survive potentially where their parent might. So there's lots of factors, but be it as it may, only 15% of the population are toddlers, but 90% of the patients that came into the ER were toddlers. And 80% of the ones of new patients that I took to the operating room were kids. No, of new patients. We had to take a lot of patients back that had previous surgeries and redo surgeries. But of all new patients, 80% were kids. It was not uncommon for us to do rounds on a kid with a bullet hole in his belly and an iliac artery injury that was operated on by the team before us. And we were rounding on him, and then his bed was empty the next day. It was not uncommon to see a young man with, on the front of his body alone, 72 phosphorus burns, and watching his physician brother cry over him. His bed was empty a day or two later. A woman with a pelvic fracture that would clearly survive in any developed country or even in Honduras was destined to die. In fact, we had children that had 15% body burns that died. And that would never die, even in the poorest hospital in Honduras or in Burkina Faso, where both of us had gone, or in any other sub-Saharan African country that had remote access to healthcare. That 15% body burn is highly survivable since the 1800s and early 1900s, and they're dying because we can't test their blood levels because electrolyte imbalances, let alone the many children that had 40 or 50 or 60% body burns, that the best that you can do is pray that they died or wish that you had enough morphine to violate your medical license if you were in the United States. Um, the, the amount of pediatric carnage was immeasurable. Feroze and I operated on this one lady named Jury. I believe she was 12. 12 or 9. 9 years old. She was, when we found her, she had shredded skin that was tacked together. We unroofed that skin to scoop out handfuls of maggots, which functionally saved her life by debriding the dead tissue. And then probably a total of 10 surgeries later, she will be deformed for the rest of her life. She's missing both of her buttocks. There was multiple teams from multiple nations that operated on her. And she functionally had one leg shortened several inches so that we can bring the two ends of her sciatic nerve, one of the two major nerves in your leg, closer together because she was missing a hunk of it. And she'll be significantly deformed forever. But her whole family system was hurt in this injury. The parents were separated, taking care of two different families and two different family members at two different hospitals. We've had children that had regular diseases, gallbladder disease, people are dying from. We saved one person's life. Feroze actually saved this person's life. It wasn't just the trauma of the war. They have the same diseases that we have here. And many of them go untreated. A kid with a simple broken arm, sorry, kid, you're just not going to get care. There's too many things that take precedence. A wound infection after a surgery, well, if we can't clean you up on the floor, there's just no more room in the 4 operational rooms that were in the operating room that can make space for you because there's a more pressing injury that had just come in through the ER. And when things came in the ER, there were often, and by the way, this ER receiving bay was no greater for this hospital than any, and it was the only single room, was no bigger than any one of my rooms in the smallest of the hospitals that I work at. It's enough to hold 4 gurneys and curtains in between. However, on each gurney was 3 to 4 kids. A third of them were dead or dying. A third were savable and could be discharged, and a third needed to be rushed to the operating room. Multiple kids were either missing a limb or would have one that would never be functional again for the rest of their life, but could maybe be saved as a functionless limb. And we saw 2-year-olds that had chest wounds and bullets, fragments in their spine, and depressed skulls from fragments. We saw 4 different classes of wound. We saw crumbling buildings. That was probably the major source. You can't drop a 2,000-pound bomb that was designed to penetrate below ground level in Afghanistan to destroy an underground cave and an underground bunker. You can't drop that bomb on a tent city or into a simple apartment building and not expect the carnage to be extreme. So that was the number one damage. And often patients had either shrapnel the size of my thumb that I would take out of a kid's arm, literally the size of my thumb, or the detritus from the flying cement and rebar and glass and other debris that would be thrown around from these bombs would cause severe damage. Or they were just in a building that collapsed and they somehow got out of from under the tons and tons and tons of concrete, because all the buildings are concrete. There's no trees. It's rebar and concrete for every structure. So when it crumbles hard. It's unforgiving. The second class of wound that we saw, besides the bombing-induced rubble, was actual shrapnel from the bombs. You can't drop, hundreds of millions of tons of equivalent of TNT on a city smaller than central Philadelphia or the LA airport, and not expect the most densely population in the world to not get hit by the shrapnel, especially when the people have been displaced 5 or 6 times. They're from all over the country. They're living in tent cities. And when a bomb hits a tent, it doesn't stop at that tent. It goes through 500 tents, through 30 people before it comes to rest inside of somebody's abdomen. And it's a very non-discriminate weapon, of course. So much so that the craters that it would leave in the ground would be enough. You couldn't imagine the building that could have survived that. So bombing, the direct effect of the shrapnel was the second most common injury. The third most common injury was some type of cluster munition, where we found toddlers that had 1 millimeter entrance holes and 1 millimeter exit holes. And then the tissues within that patient were vaporized, jello. And that is reminiscent of a weapon that Israel has vowed to replace, that the UN outlawed. Pledget, I think was the name of it, little tungsten darts. Now they have a bomb that is a regular looking howitzer shell that is surrounded by tens of thousands of little tiny tungsten metal pieces, smaller than a pencil eraser, but the same shape. And they go into a million directions because of the blast. And the velocity is so great that the amount of tissue destruction, irrespective of the minuscule entrance wound, which sometimes we couldn't even find on kids. We found the exit wound and we found the damage on the inside on a CAT scan, but we couldn't. We had to search for the entrance wound. Sometimes they're so small. But one of my, for lack of a better term, favorite photographs that represent the work that Feroze had done is to put a chest tube in a kid that had to be 12 or 13 months old, because both lungs were filling with blood. And we saw what would have been a pinprick on one chest wall and a scab on the other, that a mosquito could have left that mark. And but the damage from that type of bomb was insurmountable, and that bomb is illegal. The third type of injury that we had is a sniper bullet. The characteristic appearance of a sniper bullet is a perfectly circumscribed hole in the entrance, and a cavitating, devastating wound at its exit. I personally saw 2 children with little tiny 4x4s sitting on their chest, 4x4s meaning a little cotton dressing, and a head dressing on. And I didn't realize that they had a damage to their chest. I was just checking out their body to look for other injuries before I undid their head dressing. And when I rolled them over, my hand fell inside their chest cavity. And so when I picked up their shirt, there was a classic entrance hole. And when I examined their back, well, it wasn't there. Everything between the shoulder blades was missing. And then I ripped up the head dressing, and a second bullet went into their temple, and in one kid out of his jaw, and in another kid out of his upper temple, which reflected that the child was shot twice, and clearly the second time the child was already dead, and they were shot a second time. And that affected me more than anything in my life. Because it wasn't just a casualty of war statement to me. that is the first time that I realized um, that a genuine genocide was going on. Now, my father's a Jewish doctor, was a Jewish doctor. He's passed away a couple decades ago. Um, and so he went into Auschwitz at the end of the war to help relieve medical care. He would never talk about it. And I see why now, because it's even tough for me not to cry now. Feroze knows I cry easy. Um, he's tough as shit, but I'm not. Um, and and I remember these sepia photographs of bulldozers with the front end loader still overflowing with bodies that were about to be dumped into a grave that, because of the f-stop of the photograph, it blurred into the distance, but it was clearly 100 yards long. Um, and you can see the bodies already in the grave up close to the photograph, and there were just skinny arms and legs and heads and rib cages hanging out of the bucket. And it's not at all different than what I saw in Gaza. And then I realized uh, that my Jewish heritage that says never again really doesn't apply to anybody other than those who are carrying out a Zionistic approach. And so when we came back, and the reason why you're seeing our faces now is because we're not speaking to you as physicians genuinely. There are no journalists allowed there. They were either assassinated or shot, or they had their equipment destroyed. It was such a pervasive observation that we started a GoFundMe campaign to replace the damaged equipment and give some salary to the journalists that remained in Gaza. And we sent $12,000 over last month or a month ago, maybe a little longer. But because there were no journalists, and because the legacy American media refuses to tell the truth, we feel obligated to share. I mean, Feroze had said earlier today that this is his fifth talk today. This is my third, um, and it does pay off. We had heard just 2 days ago that our testimony um, to the British Parliament stimulated the British Parliament to vote against supplying military aid to Israel, and 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 that's a win. It's the first domino to fall. Um, Next week, we talk to the German Parliament. Forget the name of it, to tell the truth, Bundestag or something. But I'll know it before I speak to him. But the um, but the more that we can influence decision making, Feroze authored a phenomenal letter that we sent to Biden and Harris and every other senator and House Representative General. It was signed by how many docs, Feroze? 100. And this was
Yeah, by 45, and we're actually redoing it right now, and we're approaching 100. I think we have basically everyone who's been to Gaza from the U.S.
that's right, and we're it's an appeal to withhold military aid to Israel to stop the carnage. So So in our roles now, we're really functioning as journalists, and it's a frustrating role. When I did a talk on CNN, um, we had done it together, and I had proclaimed that I saw children that were um, assassinated, that were not accidental victims of war, but the target victim of the war. Um, the interviewer who replaced on that evening Christiana Anonpour, who was the scheduled, it was during her news hour, she kept saying that, well, CNN cannot independently verify this fact. And that should have been her story, that she was not allowed in the country to verify those facts. Sorry, my dogs are tap dancing in the background. You might hear that they're playing with government. No way I'm going to stop that. So sorry about that. Um, so at the end of the day, it's the lack of effective journalism that makes us need to talk, because the truth has to come out. If we can stop a single bomb from dropping we could be saving 50, 75, 100 lives, 200 lives. Because although the gurneys would come in with 9 to 12 kids, if the gurneys would come in with 9 to 12 kids, the bottom line is there were probably dozens and dozens and dozens that never came in because they were screened in the field as not survivable. The Lancet just came out with an article guesstimating that there's 250,000 people that will be hidden under the rubble. And we know from our experience, from every place that there's an earthquake, the early estimates of the number of people that died goes up exponentially once the rubble gets moved. And we've seen rubble that had spray paints on the wall saying, below this lives Yusuf and Muhammad, or martyred Yusuf and Muhammad. The amount of carnage that we'll never see is real. Third thing I want to address is the deliberate use of restriction of aid as a weapon of war. When we drove into Gaza, maybe it's my naivety, but I was thrilled to see, a couple miles worth of 18-wheelers loaded with potatoes and fruit and labeled with Oxfam and UNHCR and CARE and other food relief organizations on the side. And I thought that was phenomenal that the American Red Cross and the Turkish Crescent was there. And boy, look at all these. There must be 100 trucks ready to go in. The problem is we never saw them on the inside. And when we left, when the Rafah border was still open, that line of trucks was now 4 to 8 wide, shoulder to shoulder, bumper to bumper, 25 to 30 miles long, with rotting food on the back of the trucks. And that is specifically because Israel would not give them permission to come in through their deconfliction process. Without the permission to enter Gaza, a vehicle would become a distinct target without Israeli permission. And in fact, we were there when the World Central Kitchen vans were deliberately bombed, and they did undergo the deconfliction process. We underwent the deconfliction process, and I mean to tell you that my ride from the hospital to the Rafah crossing was as nervous an event as I've ever had in my life, because I thought I would be targeted, and I didn't think that my government gave a hoot, because on 2 different occasions I emailed the American embassy in both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and told them about our exit. Could you please guarantee our safety? And I got automatic replies that they received my email, but never a response. And I had an Israeli SIM card in my phone. There's no way I could have been missed. We were only 3 miles from the Israeli border. And I had 5 bars. I called Chuck Schumer's office several times. This is the day after he berated Benjamin Netanyahu. Figured I have another Jewish ally on my side. I spoke to his secretary from the Gaza Strip. Never a response back regarding protecting our safety of me and my team. So it was a dangerous event when we were there. But at the same time, if it wasn't for the Americans that were there and the people from Qatar and from the United Arab Emirates and Jordan, there would be no care. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I found one other orthopedic surgeon that was a denizen that was functional. And he couldn't work all the time. The healthcare system was functionally destroyed in terms of personnel. Every single nurse nobody was paid. They're all working gratis. Some of them worked at hospitals dozens of miles away, but they walked in to be helpful at the last remaining functional big hospital, which is still smaller than my smallest community hospital that I work in. It had a 10-patient ICU, and there were probably 70 ICU beds functioning, and thousands of patients in a hospital that was meant to hold 225 patients. So the system was impressively overloaded and deliberately constipated by the Israeli government. So much so that when the hospital was closed, with the brigade right after ours, something that they didn't have to do. They could have put a Bradley fighting vehicle that our tax dollars paid for it at every of the 4 entrances. And if this hospital had a wall around it, they could have scanned the SIMS card of every patient who was coming in to see if they had Hamas contacts. They could have put a metal detector over everybody's clothing to see if they had hidden metal objects on them, but they could have let patients in. They could have supplied that with the American supplies that were on the other side of the Rafah border, the medical supplies that were waiting to go in. But instead, they closed the hospital. They raised restrictions for doctors going in that are impossible to meet. I run 2 NGOs, and virtually my 25 years of doing so, the 99.999% of volunteerism throughout the world is 1 week plus the weekends attached to both ends. Because whether you're employed or in private medical practice, you just don't have any more time to give to that. And the new Israeli regulations are that you have to donate at least a month, but be prepared to stay 6 weeks. You're not allowed to bring in any medical supplies. Feroze brought in 1,000 pounds plus of medical supplies, $40,000 worth out of his own pocket. I brought in 700 pounds of medical supplies, $30,000 out of my own pocket. And if we go back again, of all the dozens of doctors that we saw there, I dare say you that I'm accurate that only 2 Englishmen that were there and Feroze and I would be allowed in, because everybody else had Palestinian descent. You're not allowed back in the country if your parents or grandparents had any Palestinian history. That would have eliminated 95, 99% of the volunteers that were there. And so they have that restriction. You can't bring any medical supplies in. You can't bring a Band-Aid in. And you can't do surgery without supplies. The infection rate was outstanding as it was. 66% of all fractures went on to not heal. 100% of wounds got infected. And we didn't have clean dressings. We didn't have soap. We didn't have betadine. We didn't have any way to sterilize instruments dependably. And this was all made 1,000 times worse by these new Israeli restrictions, which were specifically designed to make it worse. So that the 30 miles long of food aid that's not being allowed in clearly defines a genocide that's going on. And then when one analyzes the density of Hamas, because Feroze and I and not one other clinician that was there would be able to say they ever saw one person who would be a combatant, not one person who could remotely be a combatant, not in the hospital, not hiding in the hospital, not as a patient, not one. Yet, when you see the tens of thousands of people who survive these injuries, one can only surmise that it's not Hamas that Israel is going after, but it's the Palestinian that they're going after. That Hamas is the excuse, as Feroze had suggested, by the over-response to the previous attacks that he mentioned you may have never heard of. The Palestinian is not the side effect of this battle. It's not the unfortunate casualty of this battle. It is the deliberate target of this battle. And the Hamas fighter, which before the fight was 1 in 20,000, and now is supposed to be 1 in 10,000, or really 1 in 40,000, I'm sorry, 1 in 40,000 of the Palestinians, because Israel reports killing 50% of them. In truth, the Hamas fighter is not the target of this battle. It is, in fact, the innocent Palestinian. Because Israel has 4 choices, the way that I see it. They have a 1-state solution or a 2-state solution, and if they were tenable, they would have been done already. That leaves only the apartheid state that they've been supporting for 75 years, which the world is protesting and they have to respond to, or at least genocide and ethnic cleansing. And they're choosing the latter, and we're paying for it. That's all I have.
Mm. Thank you, Mark. And Feroze, this is such devastating testimony. I just want to call a period of silence for us to just sit quietly with what you've said before we begin to say more. Just a little time to breathe and to absorb what you've said. We do want to allow time for the conversation to continue with questions and answers. Feroze, I thought I would ask you if you had anything from your own experience in Gaza that you'd like to add to what Mark has said. Your presentation was about the what Gaza was like October 6th, but you were there and you saw, no doubt, much of the same thing. Anything that you would like to share with us from your own experience of uh, treating Palestinians in Gaza?
You know, Mark and I were on the same mission, and we, being the only two non-Muslims, the only two non-Arabic speakers, we kind of uh, gravitated towards each other. So we mostly actually saw, not 100%, but we mostly saw the same patients. The only thing in it, the thing that really made it clear to me what's going on in Gaza is was the shooting of children. That it's not the brutality of it is awful, obviously, and that it's what sticks in my mind and sticks in Mark's mind, I'm sure. But it's the if you just think about what it indicates, the literally every doctor who works in an emergency room in Gaza who's come back, and I've got, you know, like I said, I've got about 90 something signatures on a letter right now saying that all of them saw children shot in the head on a daily basis. That's just totally outrageous. But it's not just the brutality of it, it's what it indicates. Because, you know, it's a minority of people that are being killed by shootings. It's mostly by bombings. But if Israel is allowing its soldiers to shoot kids in the head in the catchment area of every hospital in Gaza every day, that's literally what this indicates every day. Why would you? They're clearly not. It's clearly an attack on the civilian population. Why would you think they're using their bombs differently than they're using their guns? It doesn't make any sense. And beyond that, you don't even need the violence because they're starving everyone in Gaza. So, you know, I think I'm glad I went to Gaza, and I'm certainly going to go back as soon as I can um, to work more. And I know Mark feels the same way. Really, everybody who leaves Gaza feels exactly the same way. You actually feel like you have no right to leave when you're on the van on the way out. Um, but it's not just the brutality. I just don't want to get caught up in saying, oh God, it's so bad, it's so bad. It is so bad. But it's the reason it's so bad is exactly what Mark said. It's because it's a direct attack on the civilian population. That's what it is. Most of Israel's attacks on Gaza have been exactly the same thing. Uh, and that's why we're obligated to stop it. And we don't have to send them the weapons to do this, and they can't do it without our weapons. So,
Let me ask you each, if you can, to tell us what seems to be having the most impact when you talk to people and you share this eyewitness account and you talk about the targeted killing of children. Um, um, what reactions are you getting from people who've heard your testimony?
Mark, go for it.
Okay. I've lost some Jewish friends. I've gained some. I've gotten more letters from rabbis that I've never heard of thanking me um, than friends I've lost. Um, there's a personal side to it, and there's um, and then there's the casual person that you interact with. Overwhelmingly, Because obviously, when I go out to dinner, my friends are anesthesiologists, cardiothoracic surgeon, and neurosurgeon. Those are the people I hang with, and when I go out to dinner with them and their wives, I'm astonished that when I get this response that, well, they deserve it. Look what they did on October 7th, right?
Mm, mm,
Um, the the overwhelmingly the American public, which is again shielded from what's going on, um, is thinks that the whole process started on season 75, episode 10.7.
mm,
They have no concept of the previous history of what was going on. Um, uh, and I'm guilty of that myself. It's not until I was stimulated because of what I saw to learn what happened. I was blessed to go with Feroze, who studied there and knew about it and taught me the history. Um, don't let his 10-minute presentation belie his mastery of the history. He's impressive. Um, and he continues to teach me. Um, and so my own I'm coming and I came from where my friends are coming from now. So the charge is to get people to want to learn what's really going on, um, and you can bypass some of their need to understand the history by just showing the degree of carnage. And but the average American doesn't watch Al Jazeera. The average American doesn't watch United 24 from France or the DW and NPR equivalent from Germany. Um, they watch CBS Sunday Morning, where when I went on that show and she asked me, well, where do you think the problem is? And I looked at her and I said, you are, because you represent the legacy American media and you're not going to show the photographs that I gave to you, or you'll pixelate them so horribly that the average American will still not appreciate the level of carnage that's going on. And her response was, and believe me, this is a newscaster that fought desperately to get it even on the air. She was on our side. She was there at our hearings when we spoke to Congress. Um, the Her response was, well, it is Sunday morning. To which I said, what other hour,
mm.
what better day to tell the truth,
Yeah.
right? And of course, that whole comment got cut. Um, when we went to Washington, um, one of my personal heroes, Adam Hamawe, do you know him? He's a colonel in the Army, retired now, a plastic surgeon at Princeton. So he's a
Oh,
cop.
yeah. Yeah.
He was flown to a site of a helicopter crash by a helicopter, tied off the bilateral femurs that were bleeding out, the pilot, and that pilot eventually was flown back where he operated on her legs, had to amputate her legs, but saved her life. That pilot became a U.S. Senator called Tammy Duckworth,
Mm,
um, who initially he struggled to meet with. Now, Adam is Palestinian descent. He struggled to meet with her in Congress. My own congressman from my own district has enough Jews that live in it that he can count on his hand. And he wouldn't meet with me in Washington. And trying to meet with him out of district in Tarboro is impossible. I have to this moment not met with him, even though his aide is a patient of mine
mm, mm,
and is
mm,
supporting me meeting him, even with an inside track. I can't meet with my own senator. So the
mm, mm,
process
mm,
and the fault of that is the Israeli lobby, the AIPIC, and people think that that is the number one lobby that's donating funds to, that are steering the American politicians' viewpoint, but it's not. A much larger fund is that coming from evangelical Christian churches.
mm, mm.
Much
Sure.
larger fund, 7.5 times more money comes to US senators to support Israel from evangelical Christian churches than comes from the Arab American Israeli PAC, which doesn't stand for Political Action Committee, because it's not a political action committee, because they keep winning lawsuits to not be a political action committee. It's an advisory board, so they can give as much money as they want and not be restricted by PAC laws, political action committee laws. But yet, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that are given to our non-term limited representatives and senators is really what the problem is. They're the ones that get so much money from this process that they're not going to hear the other side of it.
All right, Mark, thank you. Kate, let's transition now to opening this up. I see a couple of hands already raised. I'll start with Laura. And Laura, I see that you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Okay, hi. Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering, given Israel's apparent desire to exterminate the Gazan population and to do so in a way that doesn't allow people outside to know what's going on by killing local journalists, preventing foreign journalists from getting in, I guess I'm wondering why they even allow people like you in, because they must realize that you're very compelling voices. There's something about doctors and the kind of work you do and these horrific stories you're able to tell. Like, why do you think they even still allow you in?
I'm not sure. I was wondering that myself. Right now, they're trying to restrict that process. It's probably more because of UN regulations. Now they've raised the bar so difficult for a volunteer to go in that it's almost impossible to function as a volunteer there. I can't bring supplies. I can't bring food. I can't bring antibiotics. I can't bring medicine. I'm allowed 2 kilograms, 3 pounds of personal supplies, which is a backpack. My backpack weighs half of that. And I cannot be of Palestinian descent. And if I have any Arabic descent, they're going to presume I'm Palestinian and not let me in. And entrance into Gaza was not guaranteed before. So it's completely restricted by at the whim of the border guard of who's ever at the Rafah crossing that day. You could literally fly there and be sent home.
Yeah. Yeah, like Mark said, when we went in before the May 7th closure of Rafah by the Israeli, when the Israeli military took the Rafah crossing. So we flew into Egypt, went across the Sinai in a UN convoy, and then went in. And the reason we could take, like Mark said, hundreds of pounds of supplies with us, the way Israel's administrative process works for any semi truck or lorry, whatever you want to call it, when they were going through Rafah, is that they would go to the Rafah gate, but then they would go around Gaza to Kerem Shalom, be inspected there in this totally ludicrous and Byzantine process that was just designed to make sure nothing ever got in. And then on the off chance that they, the one out of, I can't remember what Van Hollen said, something like 1 out of 15 trucks that was actually approved, they would go back and then go in through Rafah. Now that Rafah is closed, that's obviously not available anymore. But there was also Rafah also functioned as a personnel crossing into Gaza. It had for a long time. So you could go there and you could take your personal effects. And so we all just pretended that these things were our personal effects. They obviously weren't. They were, why do I need 600 pounds of gauze to go into Gaza? It's not for me. But that was how you got these things in. When Israel took the border, they changed the location of everything to go not through Rafah because they destroyed the Rafah crossing. They said, "Oh, how can it be used? It magically blew up." And they said, now you have to fly to Amman. Mark's shaking his head because this is ridiculous. And the fact that the fact that these things are tolerated, they're just so blatant. But anyway, so now you have to fly to Amman in Jordan, come over the Allenby Bridge and enter the West Bank and then enter Israel. Well, now they say that you're subject to Israeli tourism requirements. And if you look on their website, this is literally the excuse that they're giving, is that tourists who come into Israel aren't allowed to bring more than 3 kilos of food. They're not allowed to bring more than 1 kilo of a specific type of food. They're not allowed to bring more than a backpack and uh, a personal bag. So they say, so that's the only reason we have these restrictions. And again, somehow the United States goes along with this as if it's not complete nonsense. They've also dramatically restricted the number of people that can go in. So when Mark and I were there, these are numbers that I've heard. I haven't seen them written down anywhere, but there was somewhere between 40 and 60 international volunteers in Gaza at any given time. Remember, there's only 36 hospitals in Gaza, or there were only 36 hospitals in Gaza. Right now, there's only 12 functional hospitals in Gaza. When Mark and I were there, it was the same thing. So 40 to 60 international volunteers going in seems somewhat reasonable. In fact, being perfectly honest, there were too many international volunteers at European Hospital when we were there. But now Israel has restricted it to, I believe, 9. So there's only 9 internationals of any stripe being allowed into Gaza at any given time. Also, like Mark mentioned, now the requirement is for a month. You have to go for 4 weeks continuously. Now, I'm 42. Mark, what, you're 61?
9.
16, Mark, really? Oh, I wouldn't know
Yeah.
that.
I
Mark
just
69. It is very much. It is very Mark will attest to this, I think, and I know this is a calloused thing to say because I have the option to leave. But being in Gaza is very physically challenging. This is too much information for everybody, so I apologize. But by the third day there, I had diarrhea, I had a cough, so did everybody else on the trip. I was losing weight rapidly. I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'9" and I weigh 180 pounds. When I came back from Gaza, I weighed 165. I lost 15 pounds in just 2 weeks. And that's despite the fact that I was allowed to bring, there was no restriction on how much food I could bring. I brought 4 kilos of peanuts. I brought tons of those energy, dense nutrient bars, tons and tons of extra food. And on top of that, as anyone who's ever been to Palestine knows, they will not eat unless you're eating. It's just part of the culture. So despite that, so my point is, despite all of these advantages that I had, I still lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks. Going for a month with no meaningful ability to supply yourself with food, no ability to take potable water in, oh, of course fewer people are going to go. It's just a tactic. It's harassment. It's a way of making it miserable for anybody to be there. And then on top of that, because we can't even take real medical supplies in anymore, I know several physicians who've come back and said, I went there, I bore witness to what's going on, I held people's hands as they died. Other than that, I didn't do anything. I don't have, like Mark said, you can't do surgery without supplies. Doctors' hands aren't magical. You need knives, you need sutures, you need dressings, you need antibiotics, you need anesthetics. You can't do anything. Medical care is a resource intensive thing. And without the resources, it ain't going to work. So, the answer to why are they allowing people to go in? It's a good question. They didn't at first, but on October 8th, that's when Yoav Gallant announced there will be no food, fuel, water, or electricity going into Gaza. And it's important to remember that's what they did for 2 weeks. I don't know, I can't remember the exact date, but eventually the Biden administration said, look, you can kill everyone in Gaza, but not like this. You have to do it slowly. You have to, and I don't mean to be crude, but that's basically what happened. So they've, you can understand Israel's position. They've decided, I think Mark said it accurately. There's a political solution, or there's an apartheid state, which is what they've constructed. But now they're realizing that the apartheid state is not actually as sustainable as they were hoping. And as Netanyahu was hoping, and sending money to Hamas and Gaza and crazy stuff like that. So they've decided, well, maybe we'll just try this. And the American administration, I can't prove it, but I think they've decided that, if everyone in Gaza dies, it's maybe not such a bad thing. Because, you have to remember Gaza, other than Syria, which has been, basically internally just destroyed, Gaza is the only part of the Middle East that is not under direct U.S. control. It's literally the only one. The West Bank is, Israel is, all of the Arab dictatorships obviously are. Syria and Gaza are really, and maybe you could say South Lebanon because of Hezbollah, but even then, the Lebanese government is really in charge. So it's the only place where there's an out of control population that's not doing what we say. Well, okay, if the Israelis kill them and we don't have to, we can somehow wash our hands of it. Everyone looks in the mirror at the end of the day and says, "Oh, what could we have done?" So it's a bad situation, but the good, or not the good, but the upshot of that is that we actually can stop it. We just have to organize We have to do the things like Dr. Mark is putting together here. And I have to say it's a shame that we can't all meet in person because that's really how things get done. But please talk to each other, and please, I've been talking to some people in the chat. Please tell Mark and I how to help because we're here to help, and but we're doing a lot as we're doing as much as we can, but we can't organize your community, but you can and you should because it's worthwhile.
Thank you, Feroze. Abdeslam, I see your hand. Please go. You're next.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you both for your courageous work and for your humanity. I mean, it's really very important to do this. So I have two questions. One, is there like a concerted effort to document all the horrors that you have been describing? Because eventually the international community, international organizations will have to have some documentation on this. So I'm wondering if there is somebody who is actually doing just that. And the other question is how people are actually coping, because it sounds really overwhelming. Children losing their parents, they get lost, they get how do somebody who can cope with all of this? Thank you.
Which one of you would like to do that?
So in terms of is there an effort to document it, this is an unfortunate thing. Most NGOs do not point this out before you go. That you should. There are basics and simple things about how to document. Now, I happen to have a master's of public health. I've been interested in forensic issues like this for a while, so I had some idea. But even then, I got to be honest, I was so overwhelmed clinically that, and I kept a diary while I was there, things like that. I could have done it more efficiently, but I think I documented less than half of what I actually did. And I wrote things in people's charts because that's just, of course, they're all destroyed, so it seems kind of pointless in retrospect. But but documenting for myself, I really, it was very tough. It was very hard to keep up with the clinical need and document. And I got to be honest, you're furious while you're there. I mean, you're so angry that it's honestly hard to see straight sometimes. Or you're like, and you're Mark said I'm tough as nails. He's wrong about that. But the your emotions are just going up and down and up, and you save one person only to find out that 3 people died of sepsis in the ED while you were operating, or you save you cut a kid's leg off only to find out that his whole family is dead. It's just everything is a gut punch there. So and I guess it's an excuse. I don't mean to make excuses, but it is one. But it's just challenging. Let me just put it that way. Nevertheless, lots and lots of people have documented extensively. I've given testimony to the International Court of Justice through the Center for Constitutional Rights here in the U.S. I'm pretty sure Mark has as well. I know lots and lots of other people have as well. Yeah, so that was and then your second question was, how are people coping with this? You're muted, sorry.
Yes, I was asking how people are actually coping with this trauma. I mean, it's like, it's overwhelming what you are describing and
yeah, I mean, how the Palestinians are coping with it. I just moved offices. I don't have my books here, but if you look at I showed a picture of it. It's the book called The Gaza Strip. Or it's called Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. It's by Norman Finkelstein. If you look at the picture on the front of that book, it's a young woman holding her dead infant. He's covered in a shroud, and there's just a small spot of blood on the sheet. And you can see the mother is, of course, sad, but stoic. I'm not a religious person at all, but the people of Gaza are very caught up in their faith. They are very, very committed to the idea that God determines basically everything in their lives, and God wants this for them, so they'll suffer through it. I saw plenty of people lose their shit quite frankly, in Gaza.
Mm.
But their family members would grab them, would help them, would nurture them back to a state of mind that was manageable, and then they would go on. I mean, it's not, for all the horrendous racist stereotypes of Palestinians that you hear in the American media. They're just beggars. They hate their children. They want their kids to die. Like it's kind of it's almost remarkable how not only are they all false, which you could have probably figured out because that's just not how people are, but they're actually like radically incorrect. I mean, like Dr. Mark, you're shaking your head because you must have met Palestinians in Palestine before. They absolutely do not wear their heart on their sleeves. Yeah, of course they get sad. They're devastated by everything that's happening to their families. To I'll tell you, I just saw a young, no, not a young, his name is Bara. He actually lives in Flint, Michigan, where he grew up. He's a vascular surgeon. He just got back in September, maybe a few days ago, and he told this story on a news program about a young woman that he saw in a ED walking back and forth constantly. So finally, he went to her, "Why are you walking back and forth like this?" And she said, "Well, my daughter is over there and her head has been ripped open and they said she's going to die. And I don't want her to die alone. But my other daughter is over there and her legs were blown off and she's bleeding. And they told me I have to hold pressure on the bleeding. So what do I do?" And so he said, I'll hold pressure. You go back to but that kind of thing it's very hard. I don't have children of my own, but certainly it's hard to think about a mother having to make that decision. It's devastating. But how they cope with it, I think it's mostly their faith and also the fact that they've just been through all this many times. Nothing to this degree, to be sure, but it's a big part of the culture to suffer through things like this, especially in Gaza.
Right. They've never not known trauma. Having said that, statistics are showing that the suicide rate is higher than in any population in the world amongst young people. Um, that the need for psychiatric care is obviously huge, but there's probably not a living psychiatrist in the country. Um, and I know that the toll that it's taking on people who are coming back. Um, if it wasn't for me talking to news medias, my nightmares would be every night. I won't have one tonight because I vented in this venue. Um, it's cost me the love of my life. She left my home. I mean, uh, this has a toll on everybody involved. It's not just it's and my pain can't come close to what I saw within my first hour of there. That's what puts it in perspective. We've all seen pain. Everybody who's on this show has had a lover die, who's witnessing this show. But Feroze and I have seen pain that your viewers will never see before Gaza. Incredible pain. And we've seen tragedies on a daily basis, but um, we can't, there are no words to describe the magnitude of this. And then the psychological outlay is impressive. Um, it's broken dreams for those who are surviving. It's lost family members and lost lovers. It's lost children. Who deserves to bury their child? Um, it's a lost parent when the parent's only 40. Um, it is a culture that had extended families. It was extremely typical for great great grandparents, a married couple and their 6 children to live under one roof. Um, and and that was based on an impressively loving, impressively solid family unit. I'm trying to adopt a little girl that hovered around me when I'm there because her father was killed, and and all of her family was dead beforehand, and she was left in the custody of an uncle. Well, Tara's uncle was killed since I left. Now she's left with her uncle's cousin, who can't take care of her because he had his legs blown off, and Tara's uncle's cousin, third cousin, is now assuming responsibility for her willingly. And so I'm communicating with him, please let her come to the United States. And she's a fourth cousin at best, through marriage, not blood. And the answer is no. She's my family. Right. So the measured loss of people, when somebody's in your family unit that passes that measurement, is well amplified than it would be if I lost a second cousin. I would say, call my sister and say, who was Milton again? you know um, There it's somebody that they pray with, that they eat dinner with, and that they cry with and hug every on a daily basis. It's a different world than what we know here in our country. And so the pain is amplified by orders of magnitude that we as Americans will never be able to measure.
I see three hands up. Let me take them in this order. We're close to our ending time, but you've been very patient. So let's do them in this order. Hala, Farah Khan, and Elena. So please, Hala, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mark and Dr. Feroze. I've been following you for a long time, sharing your testimonies with as many people as I possibly can, because it is important to know what's going on, and you being there on the ground is just very, very important to amplify your voices. So thank you. And Dr. Mark, is there anything, Dr. Feroze, I see it's difficult that you lived through this. If there's anything we can do to support you, whether mentally, support your work, please let us know. I'm all for it. But I have a question about that came to mind a couple days ago when the 2000 bombs were dropped on the tent encampment with families inside. And it hit me. You hear so many people saying, in the videos, that I waited 15 years to have a child. I waited 12 years to have this child, only for him to be killed like this. So there were so many issues with fertility, which leads me to think maybe there is, that's left over from previous attacks on Gaza. But also people digging with their own hands in the area where the bombs have fell. I'm always concerned, is there radiation in these bombs that are being dropped? Or is there like a risk of these people digging through their hands with the dust they're inhaling for health issues in the future? And have you seen any?
Well, the World Health Organization has estimated that within the rubble alone, the level of toxic chemicals, because their buildings were not built by U.S. OSHA standards. There's still asbestos and things like that in the buildings, and asbestos-like chemicals for structural support purposes. That the toxic load alone in the rubble is in the hundreds of millions of tons. But to answer your question directly, so we can move on, there is no radiation in those bombs. Those are fragmentation bombs, and so the death occurs by the concussion, or the direct fragment that passes through somebody.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are actually studies from like the U.S. Army War College and other places, especially of tungsten, and what weapons grade tungsten does. And Mark, actually, this is up your alley. In rats, at least, it induces 100%. It has 100% induction rate of rhabdomyosarcoma in limbs. Actually, after Castellet, Mads Gilbert, he's a Norwegian anesthesiologist and emergency physician. He really tried to push hard for the world to create a cancer registry in Gaza to analyze what especially dime weapons were doing. to these people who had their legs destroyed, their arms destroyed by them. Um, they're all dead now. So these are, you know, normal explosions create normal bad chemicals. That's for sure. I wouldn't, uh, I wouldn't tell people not to dig through the sand to get their loved ones out because of that. Um, but yes, it does have major health effects for sure.
Laura.
Thank you so much. So my question is, you talked about October 6th, and when we are talking to our elected officials and to our friends and family members, how do we make sure that we don't go back to the siege and the occupation of October 6th? What in our messaging can we say to end the horror right now, but realize that we also have to have something different?
Good question.
Yeah, this is a major reason not to accept this nonsensical thing about a ceasefire. A ceasefire, again, if the U.S. wanted to impose a ceasefire in order to stop the killing, they just do that. Like it would have been done yesterday and the day before and the day before. It's literally one phone call. I mean, that's literally, it's not, that's not even an exaggeration. Biden picks up the phone and says, "Hi, Benjamin, you're not going to get any more weapons. Goodbye." And that's the end of it. They'll run out of weapons literally the next morning, and that's it. So that's obviously not the issue. The reason that these ceasefire negotiations are so difficult for these guys to pull off, they're mostly guys, um, for these people to pull off, is because what they're trying to do is get Hamas to agree to the demands that Israel is insisting on, which are a resumption of the blockade and the release of the hostages, and then a resumption of the war afterwards. This is just transparently ridiculous. Why would anyone agree to that? Yeah, again, I don't support taking hostages. That's not the point. Just obviously no one is going to agree to such a thing. It's insane. No, and honestly, they shouldn't agree to it. It's completely nuts. So that's why these ceasefire negotiations are difficult. Everybody, you know, actually there was an amazing moment the other day where and what's interesting is actually despite that, Hamas seems to actually be agreeing to the ceasefire, and it's Netanyahu that keeps blocking it. But anyway, the point is that yes, exactly, a ceasefire, even if it's agreed upon, that just reestablishes the blockade of Gaza, just means that October 7th, 2027 is going to be a bad day again. That's all it guarantees. And I'm not trying to justify what was done that day. A lot of it was horrendous and a lot of it was unjustifiable. But the Israelis have just decided that, look, we're just going to destroy the place and we'll see what happens. And the US is backing it, and that's the issue. So yeah, that's why the demand for an arms blockade, I think, is much more sensible than the demand for a ceasefire.
Right.
It's my
to take to your senators and to anybody else who has a sympathetic ear or a remotely sympathetic ear, I would not address what happened on October 7th or the 75 years before, because that invites an argument that has too many emotional and issues, and fact-checking needs are going to be high because nobody knows the history. I would just simply say, listen, people are an innocent population is dying unnecessarily. The only way to solve this is a ceasefire. We need to stop delivering military arms to force the ceasefire. And that's the only way to do it. Ronald Reagan did it. He made one telephone call. I'm not sure where I think it was in Beirut. And the bombing stopped that day. That day. And if Ronald Reagan can do it, any president can do it, because Israel exhausts its military supply on a 36-hour cycle. And that at the most, they're going to give up all their military stockpiles. They're not going to do it. They're only going to exhaust it on a 36-hour cycle if they know that it's going to be replaced 36 hours from now.
Elena, I appreciate you putting your questions in the chat. There's probably too many of them there for the time we have left. I wonder if you'd be okay with us asking the doctors what is happening to the orphans which I am certain are huge numbers. Is there any way to keep track of them? Uh, the other questions are also very important, but what could you all tell us about that and the number of orphans that do not have any family members at all, not just their parents?
Again, the families are so extended that although there are tons of children that seemingly have no family members, a remote fifth cousin steps up to help take care of them, or strangers step up to help take care of them. You used to live on my street. I will take care of you. Um, it's an impressively loving society. They don't let people suffer. They won't let a child suffer. Um, are there orphans? Sure. Are they up for adoption? Difficult. The Palestinian Authority is not helping me. They're not responding to me. I'm trying to adopt one. Uh, Little known to them is that the family is not willing, but but they're not assisting at all. Um, but the demand for it is low because the kids that are surviving are well taken care of in their capacity to take care of them.
Yeah, I think it was Save the Children put out a report maybe a month or two ago, saying that 17,000 children are currently unaccompanied in Gaza.
Yeah.
But like Mark said, the extended family unit in Gaza is just it's not just Gaza, the West Bank too, actually. These are large, the term we use, which is kind of demeaning sometimes, is clan, but these are large clan-based families, and they're huge. So someone will, the willingness to step up and be the one who has to take care of them. Like Mark said, a guy with no legs is trying to take care of this little girl. Um, it's really a thing to behold. You have to see it in person to appreciate it. Um, it's quite a thing. Um, I do just want to, Dr. Mark, do we have a second to talk about the
Yes.
question? Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So, Elena, your other question about how do we handle people who are weaponizing anti-Semitism? I think
Right.
there's I strongly suspect that if there were no Jews in the United States, that U.S.-Israel policy would be exactly the same. Israel provides major services to the American imperial project in the Middle East, and not just the Middle East, actually far beyond it. Just ask anyone who lived through apartheid, and that's why the U.S. does what it does with Israel. That being said, one of the things that because there is a large American Jewish population and because of the history of European Jewish suffering, there is this constant appeal to Jewish safety, Jewish martyrdom, all of which are real things. But they're transparently being abused. And that's not hard to see. Lily Greenberg Call, she was the young woman who was a Biden appointee, Biden political appointee. I think she's like 25 or 20. She's quite young. It's just wise beyond her age is why I'm pointing it out. But she went in her resignation letter, she pointed out that I think I'm quoting her exactly. The Biden administration is making is making Jews the face of the American war machine. And then later she wrote a letter with Josh Paul and some other people who've also resigned in protest from the U.S. government, the State Department, and places like that, saying that, just literally saying that the exact words were that the Biden administration is scapegoating Jews, and she's right. The U.S. is not destroying. The U.S. is not helping Israel to destroy Gaza to keep Jews safe. It's any analyst with half a brain cell could tell you it's doing the opposite. It's making Israel's situation far more tenuous and far more dangerous. And then if you look at polls, it's very clear that a large majority of young American Jews feel not only that this is wrong, but actually that they actually agree that Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza. So they don't just say, "Oh, I don't like it," but they literally think it's genocidal. Now, older American Jews tend to be different, but certainly not for two of the four people who interviewed me today were older American Jewish men. So there is a very, very big, and Mark, I mean, Mark's from a Jewish family. There is a large reserve of American Jews who are horrified and disgusted by what is going on, and they know it's being done in their name, and it just kills them, but they don't really know what to do about it.
And they have to pay attention to politics.
Yeah.
We started medical school classes when we were in Gaza for the students that hung out. And when I got back, I emailed every single medical school in the Western Hemisphere that would, at least the Northern Western Hemisphere, including Mexico and the Caribbean, where Americans typically go, and Canada. 7 medical schools responded positively. Well, 2 dental schools, 2 dental programs, and 5 medical schools said that they would take a Palestinian. 5 out of 200. Do you know what the 5 deans of admission had in common? Rhetorical question. They were all Jewish. Not one was a non-Jew. And when I asked them, I had a hint when one of them was Ira Weinstein and things like that, and Benjamin Silverman. But when I asked them, why you? Help me figure out how I can get the other medical deans of admission to come around. And they said, well, for me, it was a personal decision, which was the same answer that every single one gave. He said, I'm Jewish and I'm embarrassed of how the Jewish community is handling this, that we're conflating Zionism with Judaism. And one of them told me something that echoes true, that the most dangerous place for a Jew to live in the world today is in Israel. Right. You know, and that it's a uniquely Israeli problem, that it's really a Zionistic thing. And so I think, to answer her question more directly, I think we have to be part of the definition in the separation of what is Zionism, which is a political movement started 1890-ish or in 1895, 50 years before Israel was a country, and Judaism, which is thousands and thousands of years old and based on love. They are not the same. And it's the AIPIC and the blind support by evangelical Christian groups that say that if you are anti-Zionistic, you are by de facto anti-Semitic. And that is not the truth. And that's the message that we have to get out.
And Jewish folks saying that makes it very hard to deny. You know, I think it was Abba Eban who wrote once that he was kind of explaining to American Jews what their role is supposed to be in the Middle East, and he said that you have one job. It's to, I'm paraphrasing, but you have one job. It's to show that all criticism of Israel comes from anti-Semites or self-hating Jews. Well, that's fine. I mean, that was his position, but you can take that as a turnkey and point out that American Jews who refuse to go along with that are going to be a very powerful voice. That's why Mark has been such an incredibly powerful voice. You know, nobody else could have gotten up on what was it, CBS Sunday News?
Sunday morning, yeah.
Sunday morning news, yeah, and said, I saw children shot in the head in Gaza. And the anchor looked at him and said, what? I've never heard this before, as if she hadn't. And he said, yeah, I saw it with my own eyes. What are you going to say? You know, that is powerful, but it doesn't have to be such a dramatic thing where you can't all go to Gaza, obviously. The American Jews have a huge role to play just because and it's not fair to them because they've been thrust into it. It's really not. But nevertheless, if they're interested in filling that role and in helping people that could very much use their help, that help is that role is there to be filled.
Friends, I have 8:45, and I'm noticing that very few people have left this webinar, and which is a testament to the power of our guests and their testimony, and also the excellent questions from the audience. I'm overwhelmed by your courage in going, your humanity in what you did, and also the way that you're processing it now openly with us and for us, and in all the venues where your voice is being heard. And so thank you for what you've done and what you're continuing to do. And I just want to say, I did notice in the chat that several are connecting with each of you, and I love that you're making yourselves available for anything that comes up. Let me just say, we have all of your information, those of you that were on the call tonight, and we will put, if this is okay with Feroze and Mark, we can put your contact information out to the people that were on this call. Is that all right with you?
Sure. And if you want to put my Instagram account, if somebody wants to see some photographs from there, I'd be happy to share those with you. That's at Mark Perlmutter, all lowercase MD, Mark with a K, Perlmutter, MD, will let you see photographs that I put out there from our trip.
All right. What an important night. Thank you all for being here. Thank everyone for having an open mind and heart to hear these devastating testimonies. Godspeed for everyone in all the good work that's being done.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Good night, friends.
Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.